Jeff Brown, a very, very warm welcome to the Humans versus Retirement podcast.
Thank you. Delighted to be here today.
Jeff, cannot wait to have this conversation. We have been introduced to one another through our mutual love of retirement planning. I don't know whether I never thought I'd say that to another person in my life. Although just before we hit recorded, Jeff, we have discussed a bit of a mutual love of football and basketball. So
That's right.
we might get, when I say football, I mean American football.
American football.
Yeah. We might get into that as we go along. But Jeff, you're coming from Ohio. You're caring for your mum who's just had shoulder surgery, as you just said. So residence in Illinois, a professor at the University of Illinois. And I'd love for you just to tell the listeners as to kind of why you're on the show, really, because you have delved into this retirement thing for the vast bulk of your career and written some wonderful papers.
Well, thanks for that. And thanks for having me on today. I'm really excited to talk about this topic. It's something I've cared about for a long time. So I did my PhD in economics back in the late 1990s. And from the very first research assistant project that I did working with my advisor, Jim Paterba, I started working on issues related to annuitization and how people plan for retirement when they don't know how long they're going to live. I ended up writing 4 chapters in my dissertation, all of them, 3 of them were about annuitization specifically, and one of them was about whether people were trying to undo annuitization through the use of life insurance. And then I went on to write many, many, many papers over the years, and I've also gotten very engaged in both public policy work here in the U.S. on Social Security, public and private pensions. And I also serve on the board of TIAA, which for your listeners who may not be familiar, is actually outside of some big government-run plans, is the largest annuity provider in the U.S., I believe maybe in the world, that serves higher education in the not-for-profit sector in the U.S. So I've been engaged in these issues for more than 30 years now and always enjoy talking.
Yeah, I did think that we had a very quite a funny exchange of emails. I was very late sending you the framework to this episode, and I apologized. And your email back was, "Don't worry, I talk about this stuff in my sleep. Actually, I sometimes do." Like that, and I absolutely believe it. So yeah, looking forward to really delving into your knowledge and wealth of wisdom on this subject. And really, it kind of delves into, as you said, the annuitization of, this is about thinking annuities and guaranteed lifetime income or secure lifetime income actually be the bedrock of retirement plans from a financial point of view. And I think we're going to delve into what is kind of the under-annuitization of people and why it's there in a bit. But let's kind of think about understanding annuities and their role in retirement. What, just from your point of view, what are they? And at the simplest level, how can they really, how do they function within a retirement plan?
Well, it's the right question to start with because there are a lot of products out there that have the term annuity in the name, but they don't all do the same thing. And so I actually think your use of the term guaranteed lifetime income or secure lifetime income is really the more relevant thing. That's the thing that we're trying to secure for ourselves is lifetime income. And I'll come back in a second and talk about why that's so important. An annuity is just a particular financial product that delivers that, or at least the kind of annuities that I'm talking about, which are life income annuities. At their simplest form, what they do is they allow someone to trade a lump sum of wealth for a flow of guaranteed income that's going to last as long as they live. And so the reason this is important is that we spend our whole lives, assuming things go well, earning a paycheck. And we learn to budget on a monthly basis. We learn to have that income coming in and feel relatively secure that that next paycheck is coming. And then when people reach retirement, they might have a pension, a state pension or a private pension, but typically that pension or Social Security system in the US is not enough to cover the consumption needs or the spending needs that they have. And what these life annuity products do is they help to fill that gap so that you can continue to live as you always have, living off of an income that you kind of know how to budget against and how to think about, and you're guaranteed to not outlive it. In the absence of those products, this is really kind of a hard problem because you reach retirement, maybe you're 60, 65 years old, you've got a bunch of money sitting in an account, but there's all kinds of risks associated with that. First of all, you don't know, are you going to live for 5 years or 50 years? You don't know what's going to happen to asset markets and returns and inflation and whether you're going to be in good health and whether, there's so many unknowns. It just makes for a really, really, really difficult financial planning problem. And these life annuity products simplify that problem for you and just frankly put you back into an environment that you're used to, which is spending on a monthly income. So that's why they're so core, and one of the many reasons I've gotten interested in them over the years.
I think it's really interesting when we talk about the problems that they solve. One of those problems is that risk of longevity, right? And I think that is one of the, as you've just said, one of the, I think, core risks or fears that people face. It's kind of like, I don't want to run out of money, actually. And I know our systems, and I've got a lot of listeners in the US as well as in the UK. I know our systems when it comes to kind of later life are a little bit different. I mean, you've got to pretty much, you're fully funding your medical care throughout life in the States. We've got the benefit of some free healthcare, or free-ish, over here. And that's like, but still, people have the same fears. As kind of, I know that probably expenses might get more expensive in later life if I've got to pay for healthcare or go into care and all this stuff. And I want to keep my dignity, and I don't want to run out of money, and I don't want to be a burden, and all this. So it really causes people to, I think, grossly underspend at the time when they should be spending their money when they're healthy. So, the annuity thing there can say, well, I think it's solving a financial problem, Jeff, but I actually think it's solving a life problem as well. There is a problem here where people are foregoing healthy years at the start of their second chapter, next chapter, second half of life, retirement, however you want to describe it, for this unknown thing. I might live to here, I might not.
Yeah.
And I think annuities are a wonderful way to kind of frame that and make sure you don't feel like that, so you can spend a little bit more at the top.
No, you're 100% right. And I think the psychological benefits of that, of reducing that risk, of having some certainty that you're not going to run out of money, but also not running into the other problem that you so eloquently stated, which is in the absence of that assurance that you're going to have enough, people make the opposite mistake. And they consume too little. And here they've saved their whole lives, they've worked all their lives, and now they're subjecting themselves to a lower standard of living than they could otherwise have, just out of fear, right? And that's not the way to do it. The basic advice I give people, and we can go as far or as shallow into this as you want, is just try to think for yourself. Everybody's different, but try to think for yourself. What's kind of the minimum level of spending that you're going to need in retirement to keep a roof over your head, to have food on your table, to just have the basics in life? And for different people, those answers will be different. For some people, having a little bit of travel, being able to help out their children or whatever, that's part of their basic consumption. But whatever that number is, chances are for most people, you do not have enough guaranteed income coming in from your state and your employer retirement plan to cover that. And at minimum, what I tell people is they ought to fill in that gap. Because once you've done that, if you then have resources left over, you've got so much more freedom and flexibility and just mental freedom to use that money how you wish. If you want to leave it to your kids, you can. If you want to use it to splurge on an extra vacation, you can. If you want to leave it aside in the event of some big unexpected life event, it could be a good one like the birth of a grandchild. It could be a bad one, such as some kind of an illness in your family. You've got those resources you can draw upon, knowing that you don't need them to meet those basic consumption levels. So it's a real source of, I think, financial freedom from filling in that basic level of consumption. And that really is the key to the whole thing.
Yeah, I love it. There's a couple of points I want to go on here before we move on. I've had David Blanchett and Wade Fowle and Michael Finker have all been on the podcast, right?
All terrific guests. Yeah, absolutely.
Just wonderful conversations. And I've been lucky enough to have conversations offline with them. Just wonderful people.
Yeah.
And I love their white paper that they publish, A License to Spend, which kind of doesn't suggest, factually says that people spend more money when they've got guaranteed levels of income throughout their retirement, or actually almost twice as much. And it's that kind of paradox of not being able to spend. You've got the money, but you can't let yourself go to spend it. But if you've got regular income coming in, as you set this conversation up beautifully with Jeff, we're used to a paycheck. If we mimic that paycheck, we're used to income. We find it hard
operate in that world.
Exactly. We know how to spend income. We don't know how to spend capital because we've never really been taught how to reduce that down. So,
I can add a point to that real quick. Sorry to interrupt, but spending down capital is actually kind of hard, right? And it's especially hard when you're not sure the time frame over which you're spending it down. And one of the things that we know from research is that people are really pretty bad at making that calculation. Like if you ask just normal people, average people, to even really smart educated people, it's a tough conversation or a tough calculation. If you ask them sort of what the fair trade-off is between a stream of monthly income that lasts for life and a lump sum, people get it wildly wrong. And at both ends of the spectrum, there's some people that think that, this monthly stream isn't worth very much. There's other people who think it's worth a lot. So it's just hard, right? So why do we make people do that
Yeah.
when we have the tools available that simplify that decision for them, give them the license to spend, as you say, and just gives them that kind of psychological comfort? There was a study done probably 30 years ago by some folks, and it was using data from, I believe, the Health and Retirement Survey, which is a big household survey in the US of people at and nearing retirement. And they also just asked some questions about like mental well-being and so forth. And they found that people that had more annuitized income, a higher fraction of their income in a form that was going to last for life, just sort of the more they reported, self-reported higher levels of happiness, which is also consistent with what you referred to as well. So I really do think there's something important to this.
I'm going to say something that has got no, as Jeff, I'm not an academic. I'm going to say something that might make you shudder here a little bit, because this is not baked in any research. Okay. So I've got no research on this.
Who knows? I might have some research
you
to
might
support
do.
it or refute it. We'll see.
Yeah. But my gut feel, and actually there is some, this is real world stuff, right? So conversation I'm having with people, real people that are retiring, and I do it every day. My gut feel is that there is a link between decreasing use of annuities and decreasing levels of happiness in retirement. We now know through all the research that we see that people in retirement are much more likely to be depressed than people that aren't in retirement. There's research coming out around, depressing rates in that. We know that loneliness is a massive problem, and there's more and more elderly people that are lonely because they're not getting out there. They're not spending their money. We know that divorce rates are going through the roof in over 60s, right? There's this whole host of things. And I link this to going, well, actually, if you think about all of the worries that having this pot of money and all of the burden that you carry as an individual by having a pot of money to be able to take it out, spend it, and all of that stuff that we just talked about, versus having an amount of money that's given to you every month. I just got this gut feel that, and I think about my grandparents, etc., that just seemed happier. They had an income. I know times were different, but I do think there's something happening here around the burden that's on people's shoulders in retirement now versus what it was maybe 20, 30 years ago, and the happiness levels that people will have by knowing there is some sort of security there, whereas some people are entering this phase of life with very little security. Actually, they're pulling the comfort blanket right from under their feet because they've given up a regular paycheck. They've given up this stuff. They've given up X. I don't know. Is that something that you've ever thought of?
Well, I think it's a fascinating hypothesis. I mean, I agree with you that happiness levels are declining among retired population. That is something that has been documented. Those kinds of findings are also happening at other age groups, though. I mean, in
Yes.
the US, we're
No,
finding it
Absolutely.
at younger age groups and so forth.
Yeah.
I think the causality there is really difficult to disentangle, and it'd
I
be
agree.
a fascinating study to do. And I'm going to make a note of that as I think about future research agendas. So it could be there's a lot going on when people enter retirement. So at minimum, here's how I would frame it, I think, based on what I know we can support from research, is that there's a lot happening when people retire and enter into a period of retirement. They're giving up jobs, and some people find a lot of meaning from their jobs and a sense of purpose and so forth. And so they're separating from that. They're experiencing health changes. They're experiencing changes in family dynamics. They might be losing a spouse. There's lots going on. So figuring out what exactly is causing what is really hard to disentangle. But one of those things is also this additional source of stress that comes from this shift in the financial thing that, okay, I've got what I've got. Like I now have limited opportunities to go out and earn more. I have to make my money last. There's all these sources of uncertainty. And I'm being thrown this additional challenge of now having to spend out of capital instead of out of income. Well, regardless of what's causing what, I think that anytime we can take some of those sources of risk and anxiety off the table, it's a good thing. And that's why this, at minimum, I think we can take this one source of risk and anxiety off the table by providing people with some guaranteed income. It would be wonderful if that also helps solve some of these other problems. My guess is that these problems are multi-determined and lots of causality back and forth.
Yeah.
But I think it's a great set of questions for somebody to research going forward.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think that there's wider societal problems and impact for across age groups, etc.
Let me throw out one other thing though, which
Yeah.
I do believe is a pretty clear benefit of annuitization that doesn't get as much attention, which is whether we like it or not. We are, as people age and are living longer, which is a good thing, more and more people are suffering some form of cognitive impairment before they die. Things like Alzheimer's or people that end up with Parkinson's and have cognitive health declines along the way, et cetera. That is partly responsible for why so many elderly people are the victims of fraud, right? People coming, scamming them and taking money away. If you've got a big chunk of money sitting in an account and you get defrauded and somebody walks away with your resources, you're pretty much out of luck. If you've converted it into monthly income and somebody can't take away the corpus, they can't take away the capital, they might scam you out of that month's check or something. But like just the ability to manage your finances as your own mental acuity is declining is, I think, also important and a source of comfort as you're planning for this, right? I mean, we all like to think it's not going to happen to us, right? But look, I've known plenty of people with PhDs in economics and finance who in their later years have experienced these kind of difficulties. And it's just one more thing that you've got to worry about. Again, you can take some of that risk off the table by at least making yourself having the assurance that no matter what mistakes are made, you're still going to have this income coming in.
Yeah. I've never really, I think that's wonderful. I've never really thought and framed it like that. And as you said, I mean, think about cognitive diseases, Alzheimer's, dementia. They are significantly on the rise. I think it's now the third biggest, I think, or the second. It's overtaken some. You've got cancer and heart disease and obesity, and I think Alzheimer's is right up there now with kind of the cause of death in later life.
Well, it's certainly on the rise, if for no other reason, than people are living much longer. Therefore, there is a larger population around, which is a good thing. But as we all advance in age, most of us are going to experience some level of decline. It may not always be as severe as to be diagnosed as a formal disease, but like even the best of us are going to. And we know that, like, for example, numeracy and the ability to do analytical calculations, that actually starts to decline at a fairly young age. If you look at research on, mathematicians, for example, most of them have their greatest ideas and greatest breakthroughs in their early 30s. And it sort of declines after that. There's a lot of work on this. But our ability to do complex calculations, basic numeracy, et cetera, starts to decline, I think, as early as around age 50. And, obviously there's people have different levels going into it. And some people are still quite capable in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. But a lot of people are not, or at least not as comfortable as they were back in their working years. So I think the more that you can kind of set your retirement on a little bit of financial autopilot, the better off you'll be.
No, I love that. Financial autopilot, I think, is the absolute correct phrase. Dr. Brooks's Strength by Strength book, which is behind me, he talks about this. When I read he talks, and actually when he delivers keynotes, he asks people that question, what age do you think your cognitive abilities start to decline at quite a rapid pace? And he said, everyone says, 70s and 80s. It's like, no. It's typically late 40s, early 50s. And everyone's like, what? So, and so, I think it's a wonderful framework, I think, around that. And actually, I was going to go into the benefits section of this, but I want to touch on a couple of points, actually, because I think this is really interesting. You've mentioned, I think, like, as you go through your retirement, And we've talked about those kind of initial years a little bit, what I refer to them as the kind of exploring go-go years. You've got particularly, I frame it as three phases of retirement: exploring go-go years, nesting go-slow years, and the reflecting no-go years, right? Kind of, you think about how we are. Sometimes I need to kind of, give it to people straight to get them to think about what they're going to do up the other end and do it well. But thinking about how the perception of these products are, I think people have the wrong perception, right? Because you don't have to annuitize everything in one hit. You
Right.
can, I think about this as like income hatchets, Jeff, i.e., if you've got social security or state pension coming in at later life, you can buy a little bit of secure lifetime income now and top it up as you go along, or buy enough to kind of give you enough to cover your essential expenditure when your state benefits come in, and buy a little bit more as you get older, etc. There's a lot of flexibility in these products now that people just don't understand, right? Which can help solve a journey in retirement, not just kind of
There
all
is.
all chips on red from day one.
No, you're exactly right. You said a lot of really interesting and important points there. I don't know if I'll remember them all as I start talking, but one thing, you definitely don't have to annuitize all at once. And in fact, most people aren't going to want to annuitize everything anyway, because while, if you had 100% of your wealth in the form of income and no cash on hand,
Yeah.
it's going to be more difficult to deal with unexpected expenditures and emergencies and so forth. So I don't recommend that people annuitize it all. I also pretty rarely recommend that somebody doesn't need more. It really is finding that sweet spot in the middle where you're kind of balancing the benefits and the risks. So that's an important piece of all this. The negative view that a lot of people have of annuitization, I think it comes from a couple of different places. One is, as I mentioned, there are a lot of products out there that have the word annuity in their name that really have nothing to do with lifetime income. At least in the US, there are products that are variable annuities or in equity indexed annuities. They're really more accumulation devices. They've got all kinds of bells and whistles and options on them in terms of guarantees during the accumulation phase. But there's nothing that says you actually need to turn them or convert them into lifetime income. Those have gotten a bit of a rap, in some cases earned, because the fees can be quite high. There have been some mis-selling scandals where people were convinced to hold some of those inside their qualified plan, and they were doubling up on the tax benefit. It didn't make any sense. Things like that. And so there's a company in the US called Fisher Investments that is out there going, don't buy an annuity, don't buy an annuity. And those are the ones they're talking about. But I think even the folks at Fisher Investment understand that like having guaranteed lifetime incomes are a really good thing. So I wish they would stop that campaign, because I think they're misleading people into thinking that all annuities are bad.
There's a bit of self-interest in that, Jeff, I reckon, as well, don't
Well,
you?
I would imagine so. Another point that you mentioned has to do with the claiming of state pension or Social Security. And in the United States, if you're in reasonably good health, one of the best investments you can make is to delay claiming your Social Security benefit until you reach age 70. At that point, it's not going to go up anymore, and you want to take it. At least delay it for as long as you can, because the way the actuaries have done the calculation and the mortality tables they use and the interest rate assumptions they use, it's actually a phenomenally good deal. You can view it as you're essentially buying more annuities by delaying Social Security, and you're getting a really good price on them, and it's inflation indexed and so forth. So that's actually one of the first things I recommend people do, is if they can manage their finances to do it, just delay claiming that initial benefit for as long as you can, even if you have to live off of some of your accumulated wealth in the meantime.
Yeah.
So there were some other points you made in there too
No.
that I'm sure I could build on, but like I said, there was a lot to that comment.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to that hatchet thing as well. It's like a lot of people that I work with that have forms of guaranteed income, whether they've got final salary pensions or defined benefit
Hmm.
pensions still, adding like a couple of state pensions and maybe some secure lifetime income. Most of them really find that they get into their mid 80s, even earlier than that, and they're not drawing down on any invested assets anymore, because that stuff is taking care of everything. And I think that's a wonderful picture for people to have in their head. I want to move on to what you've called the under-annuitization puzzle. You wrote a great piece about this, and really delve into this paradox of a low annuity uptake despite all of these really wonderful benefits, really, that we've not even really, I think, scraped the surface. There's many other things that I suppose that I know will kind of maybe drop into this conversation, but we know there's huge amounts of benefits, both behaviorally and financially and for living and all of that stuff. So what is this under-annuitization puzzle? Elaborate on that for me and let me know what you
Sure.
mean.
Well, so it's possible to write, as economists, we write down all kinds of formal models and we make certain assumptions about how people behave. And then we, either predict or analyze their behavior. It's really easy to write down models in which, like, rational person who's trying to figure out how to optimize their financial plan over the lifetime, given all this uncertainty about how long they were going to live, we look at it and we go, well, of course, in these models, they ought to be annuitizing. You can even write down models where they do want to annuitize everything, although those are highly simplified models. So when I was in graduate school back in the 90s, I got interested in this question because we have all these theoretical papers that say that. And then when you actually look out in the real world, you realize that the retail market for annuities is pretty tiny, at least the ones that provide lifetime income, not these other products. And if you looked in defined contribution plans, like K plans in the US and so forth, you just didn't see them being offered very often. And when they were offered, you didn't see people taking them up very often. So it's like, what's going on? Why is there such a disconnect between the models and behavior? And so I probably spent the first 10 years of my academic career and largely got tenure at my university on the basis of exploring this puzzle. And early on, I was trying to come up with all these, like, very hyper rational neoclassical economic explanations for why this might be the case. And was it pricing and adverse selection? Only longer lived people would buy the product. Was it people could risk share in families and didn't need a formal market? That the lack of inflation indexation or equity exposure, things like that. And so wrote a whole bunch of papers on that. And by and large, what I sort of concluded was, yeah, if you throw enough arrows at it, you can poke a big hole in it, and maybe people don't want to do it. But, like, it didn't feel like that's what was really going on, because it just required a level of sophistication and thinking and analysis that I was like, this can't be what most people are actually basing their decision on. So I noticed that there were some focus group write-ups that I read from the Life Insurance Market Research Association in the US, LIMRA. One of the insights they found is that when they talked to people about lifetime income, that people viewed it as a gamble. And I thought, well, this is really interesting, because to an economist, it's a form of insurance. What you're insuring against is that the risk of outliving your resources. What they were thinking about it was from the framework of, well, I've got a bunch of money, and if I hand it over to an insurance company and buy an annuity, then I'm gambling on how long I'm going to live. And if I die tomorrow, I lose my money. And if I live 50 years, I've won. And so they saw it as risk increasing rather than risk reducing. And I was like, well, how can that be? And so I got in touch with some friends of mine that were doing behavioral work, and we got thinking through it. And we're like, the difference here is that we economists think that people get their well-being from their spending and consumption over time, that they're getting their, what we call utility, or their well-being, from how much they're consuming. And if we can provide certainty, that consumption stream, that's a good thing. That's a form of insurance. But we had trained these consumers to think about, well, I've got money in the bank. And if you're doing something where I could get a lot of that back or a little bit of that back, that's more of a wealth framing. And that's why it looked risky. So we thought maybe there's something to this idea. And so the first paper that I wrote that sort of got out of the classical economics framework into more of a psychological framework was, could we influence people's decisions simply by how we framed it, how we talked about it? And so we presented a whole bunch of scenarios where people had trade-offs between different financial products. And the only difference is we would split up the population, and over here, we would prime them to think about consumption. And we would use words like consume and spend and those sorts of things. And in this other group, we use words like wealth and invest. But, like, all the information and the product choices were the same. We just didn't use the names of products. We just described what they do using these different words. And we found that half the population literally would switch between products depending on how we framed it. So if we talked about, say, a bank account versus an annuity, and we were using words like consume and spend, 70% of the people wanted the annuity. But if we gave them all the same choices and information and trade-offs, we just used a few different words, and we highlighted wealth and so forth, only 20% wanted the annuity. So it was a complete reversal. And we're like, wow, this is really striking. The results were almost too good to be true, but we published it. And then since then, a bunch of other people have replicated our results in other surveys in other countries, as well as with real data. So Monica Butler, who is a great economist down in Switzerland, actually found that they had some plans that in actuality effectively framed the decision differently. And she found evidence consistent with it. So there was something to that. And that led me to kind of a broader hypothesis then that the whole, at least in the US, the whole retirement system is built around wealth accumulation. We tell people, you got your number in mind. You need to have your magic number. You need to think about portfolios building to that number. And it's all focused on having a lump sum of wealth when you reach retirement age. But we almost never talk about what happens after that. And so I've been on this kind of push for a number of years now that we need to change that framing broadly. We need to design products that think about it that way. We need to change public policy to think about it that way. We need to change our communication to talk about it that way. And to be blunt, it's a bit of an uphill battle, but we're making progress one little bit at a time.
I'm going to rewind that and listen to you again when I listen to myself back. I'm not going to listen to my own voice because I don't like doing that. But I think that was fascinating, Jeff, and I encourage everyone just to listen to that again. So here's what I think. And so I talk a lot about how we, and I say we as both the public and financial planners, and maybe economists and people in your circles, for too long have treated retirement like a maths problem that needs to be solved. And it's not. It's a human problem. And there's a difference between a complex and a complicated problem, right? Complicated problems are like fixing a car engine, right? You've got a map towards it. You've got a manual. You put parts A and B together. And it's like maths as well, isn't it, right? It's solvable problems. But complex issues like raising two teenage girls, which I'm going through at the moment, has no manual and you have no idea what you're doing. And it's all kind of emotion and human. And that's retirement. And I think the problem is that I think financial planners have got in the way of this and financial advisors, because when someone comes in and when I say this, I think financial advisors and financial planners are doing wonderful, technically gifted work and they're great with numbers, but it's getting in the way because these clients are coming in, the public are coming in with all of this stuff, and they will try and optimize the numbers to the nth degree. And if you optimize the numbers, you're not optimizing life. Because if you do push the numbers right, everyone will go, how long have I got to live to get my money back? And then you'll put this mortality equation on it and you go, no, yeah, I'm not sure whether it makes financial sense. And we're optimizing cash flow or not. But actually, if we start optimizing humans and understanding them and their behaviors and their fears, I think advice and planning will be delivered in such a different way than it has done before. And I think what you just said was hugely impactful for me, just understanding what you've gone through and the research that you've done, because it just solidifies my message and what I'm trying to do even more.
Well, I think you're spot on. And I would make one small addendum, which is I agree with you that financial planners do some pretty sophisticated and amazing work. However, I do want to criticize one common feature of the software that most of them use, the mindset most of them use, or whatever, even before we get to the human emotional side, which is the vast majority of financial planning software programs that I've seen and advice sessions that I've sat in and so forth. They have a really naive treatment of longevity risk. And what they'll do is they'll say, oh, well, you're 60 now, according to life tables, you have a life expectancy of 85. And so we'll make it 90 or 95 just to be conservative. Well, just lengthening a fixed length of life doesn't actually introduce the risk of not knowing how long you're going to live. And the fact that you might only live 5 years, but you might live 45 years. You could die at 75 or you could die at 105. And it's that uncertainty, that risk is what guaranteed lifetime income solves for. So if you don't even have that risk in the model, then the insurance product that addresses that risk is not going to come out as the solution. And so I think that in and of itself is a problem. Now, even if you introduce that, I think it would facilitate the human conversation. It doesn't substitute for the human conversation, but it facilitates the conversation because it now says, you know what, there is some risk here. We've planned to age 90 or 95, but more and more people are living beyond that. What are you going to do in that case? Is that something that worries you or not, right? Do you want to at least have a plan in place so if you are one of the lucky ones that lives that long, you're not then forced to rely on family or the state or be a burden or what have you? I think the fact that most of our planning programs and software don't have that risk in there, it's kind of like saying, I'm here to sell you homeowners insurance, but instead of acting like there's a risk, a 1% risk that your house could burn to the ground, I'm just going to assume that since there's only a 1% risk of losing your whole house, you only need $10,000 of insurance because that's the expected value. That's not how it works. Insurance is about the risk, not about the expectation. And so I think we really need to get beyond this naive treatment of life expectancies and really focus on the core issue that makes this complex, as you say, because not only is it mathematically complicated, but it's complex because it introduces all of these really difficult psychological factors as well. I have some more recent research with a couple of colleagues that are very talented that focuses on complexity in and of itself as a barrier. Psychologists and behavioral economists will tell you that there's two kinds of problems that people have the most difficulty with. One of them is dealing with a lot of uncertainty. Our brains are just, we have a harder time dealing with risk and uncertainty. The other is when problems are what we call intertemporal. So they require trade-offs over time, over long periods of time. And people make all kinds of optimization and decision mistakes when that's together. Well, retirement planning combines both of those in spades, right? You're trying to plan over multiple decades and a lot of uncertainty, not only about the length of life, but all these other sorts of uncertainty. So it's no wonder this is a complex decision environment. So even if the products are simple, the mental exercises are very complex and difficult. And what we found from our research is that complexity means that it does affect financial planning. And it may or may not surprise you that people that have higher levels of financial literacy, higher levels of numeracy, and so forth, tend to make decisions that recognize the risk, and they're more likely to insure against longevity risk. People who score more poorly on numeracy scales, financial literacy scales, etc., are less likely to really fully understand the value of guaranteed lifetime income. And so now we're introducing this other dimension that because this is such a complex decision environment, we're now also getting different outcomes for people based on how well trained they've been in finance and those sorts of things. So this is a deeply difficult public policy and social problem and individual and psychological problem to get our heads wrapped around. That's why I've been interested in studying it for 30 years, and there's always something new to look at.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. I can't wait for that work. I've the moment it all changed for me was when I really delved into complexity theory. I had some initial work with clients, and I think like any maybe young financial planner goes through in their career, it's like I've done the numbers, I've done them really, really well. Yet I'm sitting here 6 months down the line and you're chewing your fingernails like you've just had a conversation with your fridge because you don't know what to do. And it's like your dog's staring at you a bit funny as well because he's like, why is he home all the time? And your relationship with your spouse is a bit strained. I can see that. But the numbers are all fine. And like that's when I really started the journey of going down the area of behavior and studying and researching and psychology. And it kind of led me to this complexity theory thing. And as soon as I started reading about it, I was thinking, oh, there it is, right? It's kind of, everyone is treating it too much like as you very eloquently said, it's both, right? You've got both a complex maths problem to try and solve out. Sorry, a complicated maths problem and a complex human problem. And that's a real challenge, right? Because, you're trying to kind of manage both areas. And I think part of the problem is when you try and solve complex issues with tools that are designed to solve complicated issues, as we're saying, like these cash flow models that don't, put in any of this complex stuff, it's all kind of solving maths problems. That's when I think a lot of this really starts to fall down. And there just isn't the design out there in the market at the moment. I want to get onto that because you've worked in policy making and you've talked about it a lot. I think let's think about policy implications and market design and what all that means. How can we kind of take this forward? How can we frame these effects? How can policymakers, financial institutions, financial planners, people of influence encourage people to think about this differently, to talk about this differently, to understand the differences that we've been talking about, and I think as we're both on the side here, make sure that annuities are being taken up more than they are now.
Yeah, well, there's a whole continuum of options from the soft, just make them available, nudging, etc., all the way up to, mandating certain kinds of behavior. Different people land at different points on this continuum. I've probably moved back and forth a bit, but I'm usually somewhere in the center. At the one extreme, you could just say, look, we're just going to mandate everybody annuitize. And the UK did this for a while through some plans and backed off of it because they discovered that, well, that's not the answer, because some people shouldn't annuitize because they don't have as long to live. And if you annuitize everything, you've given up liquidity and that sort of thing. At the other end was kind of the Wild West in the US for a while, where it was hard to find one even if you wanted it. It wasn't offered as an option in your 401k plan, etc. So what are some of those middle grounds that we can get to? Well, building off the framing research about wealth versus consumption, one of the things I was very supportive of in the US was the passage of this lifetime income disclosure provision, which simply says it's not enough to give the quarterly statements for your 401k plan in the form of an account balance. You also need to do the calculation for the individual participant of what this is going to mean in terms of monthly income. And I think there is evidence, not my own, to support that has an effect not only on annuitization, but also on savings rates. There was a great paper by some researchers at Minnesota and at Stanford that showed that if you communicated in terms of income, people actually would save more because they realized they needed to save more to up their income. So that's a relatively easy thing to do. You could go a step further and you could provide incentives or even mandate that employers provide an annuity option in their plan. Now, once you start mandating employers, you then run up against this balancing act of, well, great, you're not required to offer a retirement plan at all in the US. So if we start loading more requirements on, might we have the inadvertent effect of fewer people being covered by a plan? But I do think we ought to at least consider the possibility of just saying, you don't have to make people take the annuity, but you at least need to give them the option within the plan. There's a lot of advantages to having in-plan annuities. I like the idea of embedding lifetime income annuity options into these target date or life cycle funds. So these are these funds that basically automatically diversify your portfolio. And as you get close to retirement age, they tend to be less equity exposure, more fixed income exposure. Well, imagine taking a sleeve of the fixed income and replacing it with a guaranteed product that will annuitize at retirement. So I mentioned earlier, I'm a trustee for TIAA, which serves the not-for-profit sector. We have actually recently decided to go in to the for-profit market, and we are providing this kind of a product where we're providing the annuity sleeve in cooperation with other retirement plan providers, putting it into their target date funds. So this, again, it has a lot of advantages. It's not an all or nothing decision. It's just the one sleeve that provides this annuity option. We're doing it when you're young. It's going to naturally lead to conversations and communication around income, not just wealth. So those are some things that I think are very sensible and well within the realistic policy provision. I, for one, would not go so far as to mandate annuitization. There is one step in between those, though, which you could have a default option, some form of automatic annuitization. Some people have suggested, like at the Brookings Institution, that you could have an annuity trial period where when people retire, you automatically start paying them income, but you don't actually annuitize the underlying balance, so that at the end of maybe 2 years, you then give them a decision now that they've had 2 years of experience receiving monthly income. So again, there's a continuum of options. To be honest, I think we need a little more experience and experimentation with some of those before I'm comfortable settling on I think this is the socially optimal decision, but I think anything that we can do and learn more along those lines is going to help us going forward. What I can say, I don't think we should mandate it, but I also think the traditional US approach of like, we don't even talk about it, those extremes are not the best. We need to move somewhere in the middle. And I think all the debate's going to be exactly where we want to land.
Yeah, I want to pick up on one point before we start kind of moving into. I've got a couple of questions I want to get in before we wrap up. I think education is really important. You talk about financial literacy and education, and you've cited how important that is. But I think I'm thinking about now the clients that I'm starting to deal with and their attitude towards annuities could be something they pass on to their children. And so, I've got clients with children in their 30s and 40s that could be starting to think about this in the next 10 to 15 years. And it's almost that kind of, it's just that passed down rhetoric, right? It's a bit like our sports teams, right? I was told by my dad, who I had to support as a football club, otherwise I wasn't allowed in the house, right? So you just end up doing it, right? Because it's kind of you follow the lead of people that are close to you. So I think that financial education is vital. Now I think that lack of literacy and education in finances led to what went on in this country a few years ago with the big defined benefit transfers that were going on over here, where we've already seen huge ramifications because the answer was transfer out of a defined benefit for a lump of money. What's the question, right? And so many people saw the big number. It's like, you can have, £45,000 a year or £1 million. Everyone was like, well, I'll take the big number, please. I want the £1 million cash in my bank. And no one actually knew. They had not enough education or financial literacy to understand fully what they were giving up. And the advisors weren't explaining it to them because they got paid thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds for doing this transfer. And it's such a shame that thousands of people gave up the gold standard benefit of inflation-proofed guaranteed income on the promise of this big pot of money. And they've just caused themselves huge amounts of issues now. So I think it's so important.
It's really unfortunate and it's sad. And the whole, I'm not an expert on the piece you mentioned about how advisors were being compensated to do this. That kind of conflict of interest is really unfortunate. That's typically why, and some of your listeners may not like that I say this, but I always like fee-based advisors rather than commission-based advisors.
I'm one of those. I charge fixed fees for everything because that's the whole reason why I do it, right?
That way you eliminate any conflicts of interest there. No, it's true. And this is what our research shows, that translating a lump sum to a life contingent income stream, it's just hard, right? That is a complicated math problem, especially if you're embedding mortality rates in the calculation and so forth. But it's also, even if you got the math calculation right and you realize, hey, this is an actuarially fair trade-off, that calculation is ignoring the risk reduction value, the insurance value of the lifetime income. And so it's not even really the right calculation if you want to think about it from a risk reduction standpoint. So it is really unfortunate. And there have been lots of times and places and countries over the years that have done these kind of lump sum versus annuity trade-offs. And basically, I think you're just setting up a disastrous choice setting. People don't know how to make the choice. They don't know how to make the calculation. The advice is usually not great. If it's a terrible enough deal, people usually figure it out. But even there, you'll have some fraction of the population that will take up the deal. And I just feel bad for them when that happens. So yeah, it's not the way to go in all of this. No. And it's not what I would ever advise policymakers to do.
Jeff, I've got two more questions that I'd love to ask. The first one, I want you to, as an economist, I want you to pick up that working crystal ball that you've got. If you can pick that up for me and give me, I want you to look into the future for me. Technological advancements is very here and now, right? We're in a world that is going to shift dramatically over the next 2 to 3 years with AI and everything that's coming in across many jobs and industries, but also as it impacts life, etc. So, what are your thoughts on how technological advancements and changing demographics could impact the future of retirement planning and retirements in general?
Well, that sounds like a topic for a whole nother podcast in and of itself.
Yeah. We'll do it.
During the pandemic, I basically said that my crystal ball had been shattered. So I no longer have a lot of faith in that.
No.
I tend to be a cautious optimist when it comes to technology. I do clearly see the upside potential of having AI agents that are capable of, if trained appropriately, and that's a big if, would be able to provide better and better advice and walk people through these conversations in a structured way, and perhaps do it even more effectively than human advisors do. I think the combination of a human advisor with these AI tools will probably be even better. And so the potential is there to aid people in making better decisions and ensuring that they're really thinking through these things. But that upside promise and potential is partially offset by the fact that it can also be used to give bad advice. And a lot of it comes down, if we trained AI just based on the information that's out there in the public world today about annuity versus lump sum decisions, I think AI is going to conclude that annuities are a bad idea because there's so much bad information out there. It's really going to require some thoughtful effort to build tools that will help with that. I think the bigger questions that society has to worry about in all of this are things like, what's this going to do to the job market? Are we going to have more or less inequality going forward? What's it going to mean for job security, for people's ability to accumulate wealth and income over time? What's it going to do? We're already seeing AI be used for nefarious purposes like financial scams and frauds. And so as those get more sophisticated, does that make annuities even more valuable? Because again, as I said earlier in the show, it's a way to protect some of your wealth against that. So I'm not making so much of a prediction as I am pointing out the fact that it's going to be a pretty wild world out there. And we're going to need some guardrails to figure out how to ensure that people are getting access to good advice, not bad advice, that we are protecting them against what are going to become increasingly sophisticated and lifelike and realistic financial scams. But, I tend to be an optimist about not just technology, but also about human behavior and policy. So I feel like the net result's going to be a good thing, but there is some big downside risk there.
Yeah.
By the way, one fascinating thing that I'm sure you've heard about, maybe your listeners have or haven't, is one interesting way to think about this decision of planning for our own future. So when we're 40, 50 years old, thinking about our 80 or 90-year-old self, that's a hard thing for people to do. Getting back to your complexity thing. And so there's been some work that will allow people to input a photo or a video of themselves and age themselves and basically have a conversation with their 90-year-old version of themselves. I might be extrapolating a little bit beyond what has been available so far, but it's well within what's realistic today. And people tend to show more empathy toward their older self. And if they show more empathy, that can reframe the conversation about what kind of life they want to have, whether they're going to be happy with income and so forth. So there's some really fascinating tools out there that are in development or could be developed that might actually facilitate overcoming some of this complexity that comes from our own inability to just picture ourselves as a 90-year-old individual that's suffering from, the range of maladies that we're likely to have at that age. So put to good use, those things could, I think, be really beneficial.
Yeah. I talk to a lot of people about the end of history illusion, which I find fascinating, right? This kind of, when you talk to people and you say, if you're 55, you say to them, well, what do you think you'll be like in 10 years time? And they'll say, I don't think I'll be much different, right? I'll be 65. I'm not sim. And then you go, well, what were you like at 45? And they were like a completely different person, right? They think, and that's what that end of history is. It's like today's the end of history, right? We don't feel like we're going to move forward from today. But if we look back 10 or 20 years, we were a totally different person. We had different energies, different relationships, different things, different interests and all that. And it's like, well, if you don't think that's going to happen in the next 10 or 20 years, then you're fooled. So, yeah, I think if we can look into the future and actually, like you said, understand uncertainty, understand the fact that it's going to be different and make sure that we're not, planning for certainty, that's a really good thing. But we can take away some uncertainty by obviously taking some guaranteed lifetime income, which is crucial.
You just gave me a fascinating idea that I'm not quite sure what to do with. Financial planners often use Monte Carlo simulations for financial outcomes, but imagine using something like Monte Carlo simulations for different lifestyle outcomes, right? Become ill, you don't, you kind of decline, you don't. And imagine some AI thing where you can see yourself age in these different scenarios and realize there's actually a whole breadth of outcomes that are plausible for you. Now, given that, how do you want to plan differently for the future? I don't know. Maybe somebody's out there doing something like that, but I think it could be pretty fascinating.
Yeah, I love that. I think that all of that is on the table, right? And it's on the table in it's months. It's not years, is it? It's happening in
Right.
months. So
No, technology is moving incredibly fast. It's mind-boggling.
So, Jeff, as we wrap this up, this has been such a wonderful conversation. We haven't even got on to our favourite sports teams, etc. So, but maybe next time. Thank you so much for joining me, and I've had a great time kind of researching this episode and digging into your work. And I can't wait to have further conversations with you on this going forward. I've got one final question for you.
Sure.
If you could change just one belief or behavior that people have about retirement income, especially around how they think about ensuring their future lifestyle, what would it be and why?
I would want people to fully embrace the fact that none of us really know how long we are going to live and that we need to plan accordingly. That every one of us, unfortunately, has a probability of something bad happening in the near future, but every one of us also has an opportunity to live far beyond what we anticipate. And that solving that problem is quite possibly the most important problem that you can work on when planning for a financially and psychologically healthy retirement.
Jeff, wonderful. I concur 100%. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. It's been such a wonderful conversation.
I just want to say I really enjoy this. I'm grateful to have been invited to be your guest. And thank you for all you're doing to help bring retirement wisdom to the world. It's incredibly important.
I really appreciate that. Thank you. And that just leaves me to thank everyone once again for listening in to the Humans versus Retirement podcast. Until next time, take care.